we've lost 9 million birds in the last 25 years. That's 25% of the number of birds that we had 25 years ago are gone.
All right. Well, welcome to the show, Mr. Lowell Baier. And today we're going to be talking about your book. I believe it's called Earth's Emergency Room. And this is coming out April 16th. Is that correct?
Well, it's actually just been released this week. So Awesome. It can be now purchased.
Cool. It's a really good book. I learned a ton from it. I really enjoyed reading it myself. There's a lot in it that I think today's culture, as far as where our political sphere is, it really kind of tackles some of the things, at least my questions to those things, as to the importance of that, of the ESA and where it's going with politics, because we have a very polarized political situation right now, and that's really interesting for me. Why don't you go ahead and just give the audience a little bit of an overview of who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm a practicing attorney here in Washington, D.C., a legal and environmental historian and an author, and I've been here doing that work for 60 years.
Mm. Awesome. And so the writing of the book how many books have you written? Is it the first book you've written?
This is number 6.
Ooh.
Number 7 will come out later this year or in the spring of next year. And number 8 is already on the drawing boards and being worked on.
Awesome. So no rest for you, huh? You just keep going.
I do.
Well, and this seems like for you a bit of a project of passion, right? The Endangered Species Act, all the stuff that goes along with it, saving the wildlife. This seems like not just something that you're doing because you're interested in it, but because it's a lifelong passion of yours. Would you say that?
It has been. I'm a farm kid. I was raised on a very poor dirt farm in northern Indiana. Grew up in a house that had no electricity or running water. Toilet was out back and called a privy. Or an outhouse, etc. And it has been a lifelong passion of mine to be close to nature and study nature. And now, as I'm looking back over the many years of my life, seeing the devastation that nature is experiencing, it's become really a passion of mine to write about it and investigate it.
Awesome. And would you say because of the fact that you said you grew up on a farm, correct?
Yes.
Would you say because you grew up on that farm that had a lot of impact for you as far as like climate change and weather and your passion for that being included into what you're doing with wildlife? Do you think that that's really like kind of, changed your mentality or formed your mentality on where we're going with the ESA?
Well, yes, it forged my mentality, John, very much. Because you live by the weather, you live by the seasons, and so forth. And I was in the Boy Scouts throughout much of my younger days, and there was a particular merit badge that I worked on called entomology, and that's collecting bugs and studying bugs and putting them, in a case and so forth, and understanding the role that particular bug or butterfly played in our universe. And that's really what initiated it, is not only growing up on that farm, but then beginning to understand what the bugs were about and what their life was about and how they affected our life and our crops, and the farming.
And the balance of this world, right? Like there's this misunderstanding, I think, from people that don't really, they're not very educated as to, how the ecology and your environment impact each other. I think we're all becoming a little bit more aware when it comes to like things like bees, how they impact our environment. But I think that sometimes as human beings, we may, put ourselves a little too high up on the pedestal and don't really, educate ourselves enough to how something like a butterfly or a bee or even some of the insects that we're not the most fond of, like a potato bug, how those things really impact the balance and ecology of our world. So can you do me a favor and just explain, give me a summary of what the Endangered Species Act is and why is it so important?
Well, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. There were earlier versions in 1966 and 69, but it was totally rewritten in 73, and that's what we focus and talk about today. That was during the Green Revolution. And during the 60s and 70s, America, the war was behind America, World War I and the Korean War, and America began to look around and realize that its environment was changing, and things were going on that concerned them greatly. The Cuyahoga River up in Ohio caught during that period caught fire for the 13th time because of wastes that were being dumped into it. The Santa Barbara oil spill occurred. Love Canal and the discovery of chemicals that had been buried in a subdivision built over the top. And as they began to leach out, cancer throughout that neighborhood was becoming demonstrable. But also, extinction was very much a part of the recognition of the problems that were happening then. The whales of the oceans were in trouble. The condor was dying off. The American bald eagle was dying off and on the verge of extinction. I could go on. The whooping crane was a prominent species back then that caught the public's attention, and so they pushed the Congress. Finally, the Congress was back then listening to the country, and they pushed the Congress to address the extinction issue that the decline of these species presented to America. And the Congress then passed the Endangered Species Act in an attempt to stem the extinction crisis that the public recognized was going on. That's a little history of how it all started, and it was passed unanimously in the Senate, and the House only had 4 on the final vote. That only 4 dissenting votes. It was a unanimous gesture of the Congress, similarly, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is the mirror image of the Endangered Species Act, was passed during that same period, along with the other major environmental laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the environmental, the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, were all passed during that period. But the capstone was the Endangered Species Act. The other acts during that period were the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and so forth. I could just go on. But there were 67 environmental and consumer protection laws that were passed in that era, because that's when Ralph Nader and the problems with the automobile industry surfaced. They were part and parcel of the country taking a look at the ills that it was suffering, and they caused the Congress to focus on it seriously. And the Congress in that 20-year period passed 67 environmental protection laws and consumer protection laws.
And for people that maybe misunderstand, it's not just about saving these beautiful animals. It's also about impacting our lives, right? Like you said, when you talk about chemicals being dumped into rivers catching on fire, chemicals being buried. These are all things that are actually really important to human life, right? Like, it's not just the animals, but in doing these things for the environment, we're also taking care of other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it was it was part of the, I'm going to say, the big tent, if you will, of the environment. The Endangered Species Act is just part of it. But we are dealing with a biodiversity crisis that started being recognized 15 or 20 years ago. But the Endangered Species Act, which is now 50 years old, was but a part of that, because the biodiversity that I'm talking about is the collection of all living organisms on planet Earth. All living organisms, bugs, fishes, wild animals, and man, etc., as well as microorganisms that are part of that same universe. And they all rely upon each other. And from that diverse system called biodiversity, man gets his food, his clothing, his shelter, um, uh, and his medicine, most importantly, as well. So it's all part of a bigger picture. And so we don't want to lose sight of the fact that although the Congress acted in 73 and throughout that 20-year period, all of this was part of the bigger picture of what we now call a biodiversity crisis.
Yeah, and so when we talk about the importance of something like the Endangered Species Act, it's some people may misunderstand. They think, oh, you're just doing this because you don't want this to go out to become endangered or for it to become extinct. But it's also a human problem, and that's what makes legislation, like you said, what'd you say, 67 pieces of legislation in that 20-year period, so incredibly important, because even if you're not an outdoorsman, if you weren't a Boy Scout, if you're not a climate change activist, you're affected by this, whether or not you want to believe that or not, because this world is a gigantic balancing act that includes all of these different and diverse things. Like, what would happen? Maybe you could tell me this. What would happen if, say, the bees that are pollinating, if some of them went extinct? What would happen potentially to the world
Well,
and its environment?
that's a fundamental question that I wish the public would focus on, because it's the pollen. Let's talk about pollinators in general. Bees and butterflies and birds are all pollinators, and
Mm-hmm.
they pollinate our crops, the food that we eat. And as these pollinators die off, the food crops are being affected by that, very much so, because they're not going to get pollinated properly. Now, corn and wheat are pollinated by the wind,
Mm.
but other crops like soybeans, like um, rice, and so forth, are all pollinated by these species. And we have lost nine. Just talk about birds alone. We've lost nine million birds in the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's 25% of the number of birds that we had 25 years ago are gone, totally gone.
Wow.
That, and from just 25 different families of birds. The bees, there are two different types of bees. You've got your wild bees, and we have lost about 48% of those. And then
Mm.
you've got your what I call domestic bees. You see the white boxes that are carried around the country and put at different places, and basically loaned to that farmer or rancher for a mating period, and then they go back to California, or wherever they're stationed for the wintertime. But from our and we've lost, let's see, we've lost 42% of what I call our domestic bees for hire. The
Wow.
the monarch butterfly is just one example of the butterfly world is down 90%. And there are
Mm-hmm.
two different colonies. You've got your western monarchs, which uh, winter in Southern California. And then you've got the eastern monarchs, which fly all the way to Mexico and winter there. Those
Mm.
populations are down. There's a few percentage differences, but they
Mm-hmm.
about 90% of them have gone extinct, have died. And
That's
as
in.
this type of I've now mentioned birds, bees, and butterflies, as our
Mm-hmm.
pollinators die off, it is causing serious problems in the food production industry,
Mm.
which
And we
which
can.
is which is a whole nother subject.
Yeah, I was gonna say we tend to kind of we're so basic with what we blame on things, right? So when we talk about food and we talk about food costs and we want to talk about statistical things. We want to talk about inflation. We want to talk about the president. We want to blame things that are in some way really simple. And when we get into talking about things like pollinators and the type of issues that it could cause for something like that to become extinct, that kind of gets past like the basic level that people my friend calls it snorkeling. She says people oftentimes when they want to talk about a complicated subject want to snorkel, so they just want to go right under the surface. They never want to dive deep into the subject. And when we start talking about something as complicated as pollinators and how our food system is incredibly dependent on these pollinators, that's where we start to get to a point where we have to understand that some of this stuff, unless you're into it like you are, you're not going to completely understand. And that's why we have to have experts and people that are as passionate as you are about doing it. Because
Mm-hmm.
without you guys, the rest of us are sitting here, blaming it on, the Ukraine war, the president, or inflation. And not to say that those things don't have, some type of substance to be discussed there, but also, like I said, we gets down to a more complicated level. So recently, there have been some changes to the ESA Act, correct?
There have been recent. What was that, John? Recently, what?
On March 29th, there were some new changes to the ESA Act.
Well, yes, and I'm smiling. Um, it's much ado about nothing. It's
Okay.
political theater, and it's very complicated. The the Congress passes the law, but the United States Fish and Wildlife Agency then implements the law. And to do that, they create a series of regulations. Now, back in 1973, when the 20-page act was enacted by Congress, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then created 5,000 pages of regulations to implement the Endangered Species Act and enforce it.
Mm.
Today, now there have only been three major amendments. The last one is 1988 by Congress. Today, that law, that 20-page law from 1973, is now 50 pages. However, the regulations adopted for its implementation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are 50,000 pages.
Ooh.
50,000 pages of regs. Okay. Now, what happened in late March was that the successive administrations want to go back, and it's all political theater, want to go back and change some of the regulations that the prior administration had created. Okay? And so the Trump administration created some new regs and changed regs that the Obama administration had adopted. And then the Biden administration comes along and withdraws or amends some of the regulations that the Trump administration did. And when you get into the weeds as a lawyer, which is what I do, when you really get into the weeds, it's all political theater, because what really controls is the law that the Congress passed, not the regulations that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service live by and adopt. Yes, they control, but the changes that were made were really in the weeds, and it's much ado about nothing. It was all, when I really analyzed it deeply, it was all political theater. Now, I can go into some specifics if you want me to on one or two examples of the several regulations that they changed. But I will tell you right now, it's political theater, and
And do you think
it's disgusting.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is we in reading your book, it seemed like when this was when it was initially brought to bear, the act, the Endangered Species Act, it seemed like you had so much more bipartisanship, so much more
Mm-hmm.
political reaching across the aisle. I think you have in there Newt Gingrich, who is potentially a left wing boogeyman of sorts for for the left wing. But you look at it, and he was an animal lover, and there's the picture of him with the red-tailed hawk, and
Yeah,
you start to think about the difference between that climate, no pun intended, and this climate that we have politically with
yeah,
people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Lauren Boebert, even on the left with people like AOC, and you have these big personalities, and
yeah.
there's so much political theater in today's politics that it seems like, as I often say, there's a lot more symbolism in politics than there is substance. And I
Yes,
think that that's really getting to the everyday person. It's exhausting the voter. It's
right.
becoming this like soap opera of sorts,
Yeah,
or
that's right.
reality TV. And
That's right.
so, do you think that the ESA, do you think it's in any danger when you have people like that being put in charge, when you have people, when you have the voters voting for what I call the American Idol type of president, or the American Idol type of Senate person? Do you think that that puts the ESA in danger?
I would have said no a few years ago, but I'm getting more and more concerned.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back 20, let's see, 25 years, if you go back, there have been 605 bills introduced in Congress to dumb down, repeal, or gut the Endangered Species Act. 605 attempts. In this current Congress, there have been over 50 that are trying to do the same thing.
Mm.
Every year, the Congress is introducing and discussing laws, a lot of it pure political theater for reelection purposes, um, on the Endangered Species Act. Now, the country has been very, and the public, thank God, has been very unified in sustaining the act, not changing it, and leaving it alone. And they're very protective of that act. The
Mm.
last amendment, there have been six minor technical amendments to the act, but there have been only three major amendments. The last one, 1988. And the reason that nothing has happened since then is because once you open up discussion and debate about the Endangered Species Act in the Congress, people fear that, again, we will have the children in the Congress playing with the act, dumbing it down, trying to repeal it, and so forth, just like they're doing right now.
Mm.
And so, as this bitter partisanship continues, I'm constantly vigilant and always fearful that something like that could happen. But again, I go like Harry Truman said: trust the public, because the
Yeah.
public knows the importance of the Endangered Species Act, and it's now systemic within their families and their
Mm-hmm.
successive generations. Thank God, thank God.
Yeah. Yeah,
Now
more intuitive now,
there's a
right?
dark side, which I call, what do I call it? Um, well, there's a dark side that those that are constantly clamoring for changes in the act. It's a dark mythology that has followed it ever since a major lawsuit, the first major one that went to Supreme Court in 1978. And a dark mythology has followed it ever since, that also has gotten passed
Mm.
generationally. So it depends where you are and who you're talking to about it. But the majority of Americans support it and protect it.
Yeah, and when you say dark mythology, I've ran into this a couple times recently with what I would say are the conspiracy-minded type of people, And are you speaking to this idea that people believe all of it has been created, all of it is just a conspiracy to make more money for government to I've even heard things as crazy as saying it's an attempt to use green energy to decrease the poor population. I mean, it's gotten further and further out there and out there as people. I think one of the problems, obviously, is the internet age, and that
Yeah.
people have access to so much of this information that a
Yes.
long time ago would have just been, maybe your friend, one guy that you knew had read a book or something like that, and now they've been able to conglomerate and form these big forums of people that are hundreds of thousands of people strong and pass along this different type of information. So that's what you're talking about is also on the other side. You do have these people that are like kind of posing these conspiracy theories.
Yes. Exactly. They believe me. This the the outgrowth of the public media. I'll call
Mm-hmm.
it the public media. It has really been a problem, not only for this act but for other congressional acts as well.
Yeah, there seems to be a conspiracy for everything now. It seems like
Yeah.
whatever you come up with, it, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, you could literally have something called "Save the Puppies," and somebody would figure out a way to say, "Oh, they're not actually saving puppies. That's actually Big Cat or something like that." Like it
Sure.
really seems like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's a real problem, and that's why I fight so hard, and I'm so passionate about our environment and so forth, because people, uh, with all the false news that's out there, I go back
Mhm.
to the facts and stick to my facts. Is what's happening with the birds, the bees, butterflies, and other, and
Mhm.
other uh, parts of the natural world.
What do you say to
Like
people that
sometimes
say
I'm
things like
fighting
that?
the flat Earth Society.
Yeah. So, how do you, as a person that's really well educated in this, because I have these arguments with people and I debate them and I do my best, but what do you say to somebody that says something like that? That there's this big conspiracy behind climate change, there's this big conspiracy behind endangered species. How do you approach that subject with them?
Well, I first of all asked them to provide me the facts
Mm-hmm.
upon which they have based their position, and then I respond with the actual facts of
Mm-hmm.
what's happening out there. And I always go back to my facts, my
Yeah.
solid scientific facts.
Yeah, and what I've encountered is people saying things like, specifically, like, this has nothing to do with the environment, but with COVID lately.
Yeah,
I say, well, the majority of information, the preponderance of evidence is on the side that the vaccine was safe, it was effective, it did have, good portions. And then someone will say, well, there's this one study from Robert Malone
yeah,
or from Mercola, and it's being suppressed because it's real information. And do you encounter that with climate as well?
yes,
And what do you
yeah.
say to
You
those people?
especially with climate, you run into it all
hmm
the time.
What do you say to those people when they say, yeah, well, this one piece of information is being suppressed by dark forces to keep the government being able to make all this money off of green energy in the future? How do you? I know that you can counter it by saying, well, I have the preponderance of evidence, but that doesn't seem to change these people's minds. If you were attempting to
No,
in some way change their mind, how would you go about that?
well, I'm 84 years old. I've been
Mm-hmm.
at this a long time, and changing the minds of certain people that don't want to hear what you've got to say
Mm-hmm.
is it's going to be just part of living with that, and I have to bypass that and talk about the facts that perhaps the people listening to the dialogue will hear, and you appeal to the broader group than just the one-on-one that's uh, post, uh, posturing with a particular study of somebody's and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really drill and ask them, tell me about the study. Tell us all about the study. what does it say? Where did they get their facts and so forth? And get them to go on the defensive, and put them on the defensive as to sustain their position. And
Hmm.
they can't do it. Generally, it's all hearsay.
Yeah, and oftentimes in these conversations, that's where I end up with people is they'll go, "You just have to do your own research," And one of the funny things is I say, "Well, I speak to people who have 40, 50 years worth of experience. I speak
Yeah.
to people that are involved in the actual situation. I read real studies, and like my biggest thing is to find meta-analysis, something that's being looked at by somebody else and over a preponderance of evidence once again." And I think that our society works off of that. Our society works off these rules of the majority decides something is true to a point based off of how much information exists that falls on one side or the other, the guilty or not guilty verdict. And oftentimes when I'm talking to these people, I try to convince them of that fact, that though you may not believe it's true, if we have the preponderance of evidence scientifically, that's where we're going to most likely fall in our opinions on whether or not it is true. So I like hearing you say that, because I think that you, in attempting to change one person's mind, may forget that you have this wider audience of people that are listening that
Yep.
may actually be hearing something that you say specifically, not something I say. I'm not very educated to the subject, but something that you say, that somebody might say, you know what, this guy has 40, 50, 60 years of industry experience. Maybe he knows actually more than I do. And I hope that I see more of that, because I think when you talk about the political situation that we have and misinformation and miseducation, that's going to be incredibly important for future generations when it comes to subjects like this, because I tell people this all the time. One side of the subject wants idiocracy, and the other side of the subject wants the giver.
Yeah.
It's either everything's the same, or we dumb everything down to a point where nobody knows anything, and you sit at home watching Ouch My Balls. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
and I hope that we can find a balance, because just like in nature has this beautiful balance that is the life forms, the fauna, the flora, the ecosystem of the oceans and the atmosphere. And human beings need that balance as well. We need
Yeah.
to be able to have this bipartisanship where we can say, you know what? You can be suspicious. You can be skeptical. You can say, hey, what about this one study that doesn't agree with the 10,000 other studies? But we have to still be sane, and we still have to be able to meet in the middle and say, this is where the preponderance of evidence lies. Now,
Mm-hmm.
speaking about those constituents, we're going into an election year. We have Joe Biden, we have RFK, we have Jill Stein, and we have, of course, Donald Trump. And we've already seen Donald Trump's environmental policies, and we've seen Joe Biden's policies. RFK, we know about some of them. Obviously, he had some environmental work that he did, and I'm not real up to date on Jill Stein's. But do you think that there's a particular presidential candidate that would best represent the ESA, or do you think that's just, like you said, maybe it's already in there and we're gonna be fine with what we got?
Uh, Clearly, the evidence would point to the concerns and the positions that Biden has taken,
Mm-hmm.
starting with climate change. Climate change has got immense, immense um, issues that are just not obvious. And his focus on climate change speaks legions about the issues that are involved with the greater climate change position and the greater climate change problem. And Trump really never focused on that at all. So
Mm-hmm.
I would come down on the side of Biden. And let me just give you an example. I spoke earlier, John, about the biodiversity crisis. The biodiversity crisis is being exacerbated by climate change. They go hand in hand. And extinction is right in the middle of this issue of of the biodiversity crisis, but it's being exaggerated by climate change. It's a very deep subject when you look at those two issues, climate change and its effect on the biodiversity crisis. Mm. And without going into the specifics, the Biden administration, hands down, looks at the broader picture and sees the broader picture.
And I agree with that a lot. I myself, I bought a shirt during Donald Trump's presidency from the EPA after its budget was slashed, and it says it's Smokey the Bear, and it says only you can prevent forest fires. No, I mean it. We don't exist anymore, so it's only on you guys. And I think that was kind of an encapsulation. And no real surprise, as today's Republican Party is all about getting rid of legislation, getting rid of administration, and it seems as though it's becoming even more dumbed down to the point of look at Donald Trump standing next to these gigantic stacks of paper while he cuts a ribbon to show everybody, and then obviously, not to do with climate change, then we have problems with the railroads. We have problems with, the economy. We have all these, problems with antitrust laws not being enforced. And people, I think, every one of these topics, whether it's the economy or the climate, they're all extremely complicated. And that's why it's been so important over the last 100 years to have people, or even further, I mean, last 2,000 years, to have experts and scholars that are well informed and like yourself spend their entire lifetime speaking to a certain subject. And I think one of the problems with today's internet age, as one of my bosses had brought up before, is that everybody's an instant expert. And everybody, if you're a virologist today, you're a Ukraine war specialist the next day, you're a climate change expert the next day after that. And I think that we have this real problem right now in our society where everybody feels like they need to have an opinion on a subject, and they think that means that their opinion will, no pun intended, trump your opinion because they've spent 2 hours on the internet looking up climate change. I think that's a real problem.
Right.
Well, in your time, you've been doing it for a very, very long time, and I love the book. I think it's a great book. What would you say is the thing that you are the most proud of that you've done in your career?
Yeah. I want to come back to the book in just a minute. Mm-hmm. But the thing I've been thinking about that question, and it's probably purchasing and putting into government hands for protection the balance of Theodore Roosevelt's Elkhorn Ranch in North Dakota. Right next to he went out there in 1884. Let's see, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, he went out there first in 83, but he went back in 84, and he stayed out there for about 3.5, 4 years as a cowboy, and established the Elkhorn Ranch, which had a major piece of geography that he called the Elkhorn Ranch, which we have defined. Now, part of it has been protected by the creation of the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. But right next to that was 25,000 acres of privately owned land that was originally part of the range land of Theodore Roosevelt. And bless them, the old folks that owned that did not want to get it chopped up into ranchettes and advertised as, own part of Theodore Roosevelt's history and his former ranch. And so I was asked personally by the Secretary of Interior to quietly go out there and buy that property for the federal government. And so I raised I went all the way around the United States with a tin cup, raised $6.5 million, and I bought that property, and then conveyed it. It was conveyed at the settlement table to it was intended to go to the Interior Department, but politics got in the way and it went to the Forest Service. That's okay. It's at least protected. But what it did is it protected the balance of that ranch of Theodore Roosevelt indefinitely and increased the size of the Theodore Roosevelt National Park by 1/3. So that's probably, if I look over my 60 years of work doing different things, that probably jumps out as the most positive. Um,
And what
that's
an
it.
amazing accomplishment. I mean, that's something that literally my children, I have two children, my children will benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
And something important that you say there is you talk about Theodore Roosevelt going out and being there. I think once again, when we talk about the internet age, we don't have enough people getting out and experiencing these things to realize how incredibly important they are for them to exist, not just for the rest of our lives, but for our children and our grandchildren's lives. It's in your book actually. It references a book that I just saw. I think is it the New Spring? Is that the conservation book, New Spring, or God, I forget what it is, but it was just in the show on Netflix, The Three Body Problem, and it talks about how the diverging paths of humanity, one towards technology and its inevitability of technology, and the other side being, obviously nature, and how we have to split that fork and continue to have the balance, and how important it is to not just embrace technology to the point that we forget about nature, and obviously the inevitability of something like technology, and how we have to kind of create a balance between the two that works. And that was just kind of an aside where it was, I was just watching that show, and it's a part of that show which has some real cultural themes to it. And then I saw that in your book as well, and I thought that was actually very important for society. So when you talk about Theodore Roosevelt getting out and being there and seeing it and going, wow, we need to keep this. This needs to be here 2,000 years from now. It still needs to be a
Well,
thing.
I label that campaign as saving the cradle of conservation.
Mm.
I'm a Roosevelt scholar,
Oh,
and
okay.
when you really study TR and his history and what he wrote during that period, that the cornerstones of our conservation today were established in his rich mind from his observations during his time, not only in just the Dakotas, but he also went through Wyoming and Idaho and Montana while he was out there on horseback looking at the world and his ideas of uh, something we call today the Department of Interior, the Forest Service, and other good conservation practices all emanated from his time out there, his personal observations sitting in that saddle.
So,
And it's a fascinating story, and that's why and the media picked up on it, and it's called the Cradle of Conservation.
hmm. All right. Well, and like you said, you want to get back to the book here. Um, the book itself is an amazing book. I really enjoyed it. I think that it shows a lot of the things that we're lacking in our culture today: bipartisanship in our politics. As you said, Theodore Roosevelt getting out and seeing things. That a lot of that is addressed in the book as well. If you could give people a quick synopsis of the book and what's important about the book, what would it be?
I should first tell you, John, that book was the end of a trilogy. I had
Mm,
written Volume 1, the first 50 years of the Endangered Species Act, um, and that came out last summer, August, followed by Volume 2, the next 50 years of the
mm,
Endangered Species Act, which came out in December, and then this book. My publisher asked me to write this particular book. He said, the other two are heavy, well researched academic treasures and research for research scholars and for the current implementers of the Endangered Species Act. However, they're pretty heavy. In one of the reviews, some reporter weighed volume one and said it weighed 6.5 pounds. It's a real doorstop. And he said, Lowell, he said, I want you to write a book that abridges those two at the layman's level. Well, I went back and I started. I didn't want to do it. My God, I was tired. It took 5 or 6 years just to write those first two books. And I was ready to put the ESA down. But he said, no, you've got to write the book at the layman's level. Well, when I went back through my notes, I interviewed about 75 people during that long 5 or 6 year period of all around the country. And I began to, and I was here in Washington when it was passed. I'd already been practicing law for 10 years when the Endangered Species Act became law. And I knew the people, all the people that were involved with that. I used to duck hunt with John Dingell Jr., for God's sakes, who was the champion of that. And so at any rate, I started going through my notes and I realized, my God, there's a backstory here. There's so much. And so not only is this book a simple abridgment of the 50-year history of the Endangered Species Act, but it's got in it sex, drugs, violence, fistfights, perjury, jail time, murder and a suicide, and fistfights galore. I mean, because what happened was, with the Endangered Species Act, it took away the jurisdiction of a lot of endangered animals from the states, who had control of those animals from day one, from statehood. And all of a sudden, this act is passed that takes them out of the hands of the states and says the federal government's in charge. Well, believe me, the fistfights, the clashing of implementing that act in the first few years, first 10, 15 years, were just incredible. So your readers will enjoy the backstory as well as the real story of what it was. But the backstory, the human side of enforcing an act of Congress that caused a lot of sparks.
Yeah. And you just said it, the human side. That is really kind of a culmination of what we talked about a little bit earlier with the people that are very conspiracy minded, that they want to, how do you reach those types of people? I think that your editor or your distributor had it right. I have gigantic books right next to me that are 1,400, 1,600 pages. I like to read big, thick volumes of books. I've read George Washington, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Alexander the Great. I really like world leaders, specifically military leaders. But some of those books really just don't appeal to your average American. They just don't have the attention span for it. And you creating this book feels like a real culmination for the humanism of the act. And I'll go back and check out those other two books for sure. That's amazing. So as far as the book...
There is a website that if your listeners are interested in pursuing further education on this, go to this website if they'd write it down. It's ESA AT, not the circular A, but at ESA at 50.com.
Okay.
ESA at 50.com.
Awesome. And then as far as getting the book, where do you have the book at? Is it on Amazon or?
Yeah, it's Amazon. It's and most major bookstores are carrying it.
Awesome. Good. And do you have a website yourself, other than that one, just for you as an author?
I do, but my publicist took my personal website and put part of it into the ESA at 50.com.
Okay.
But I do have a personal Lowell Baier website that tells a little bit more about me, but much of that is in the ESA at 50.com.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time. I'm super thankful for you getting on here.
Would you like to know about the next book? Would you like to know about the next book?
Yeah, let's hear about it.
I'm a farm kid. I was raised on a farm, as I said earlier. And it has troubled me for years when I went back and visited that farm. that it became um, bought up and put into a huge agricultural holding and became part of a big industrial farm, 3,000 acres.
Yeah.
And that's always disturbed me. And so I began to delve into the industrial farming industry, primarily because of the fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, and all the chemicals they use to grow our food. And I'm into it, and I cannot believe the damage that industrial farming or agribusiness has done to this country.
Mm.
And I'm working on that project right now, and I'm anxious to get the information out there because it's incredible. I mean, and I've got a good friend, very good friend, that is probably the leading expert on ESA in America, who went to work for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And I said, why are you doing there? And he said, because the chemicals that are the big problem in our ESA world because of what they're killing. And after 6 months of research, I just shake my head. I just can't believe it. So that's the next book that'll be coming out in a year or two.
I'm actually really interested in that. My trade, but my profession is I've been in health food grocery for 20 years. Yeah, so that's actually incredibly interesting to me, as obviously a lot of what we've seen in the industry that I work in is, the advancements in organic, the advancements in attempting to get chemicals banned. And so that actually, yeah, that's right up in my alley.
Well, we'll talk more about that in the future.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to get together with you on that one. But,
Okay.
I really do appreciate your time so much. I'm super thankful for you getting on here and giving, your outlook on these things. The book is amazing. I think that it's super cool, and I think that people should get it. And I'll make sure we'll talk about it a little bit on my live stream as well. So
yeah, because the name of the book, we haven't said it, is called Earth's Emergency Room. That's the name of the book, Earth's Emergency Room, which is what the ESA really is. It is the triage point at which animals that are in crisis and all organisms that are in crisis get put into to be recovered. Getting the species recovered.
Yeah, and that's incredibly important. Thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed that conversation. And if you want to see more conversations like that, check out these podcasts. Until next time, remember, get educated and get out and vote.